I just want them back. I just want them to come back. And if they're not safe right now, that's what's tearing me apart. Because if they are safe, they're coming back. But if they're not, this has got to stop. Like, somebody has to come forward.
Tell them you love them.
You're welcome. We love you.
Say love you.
Candy.
Oh yeah, shoot, that's in here.
Objectively say that this is perhaps the most inhumane and vicious crime that I have handled out of the thousands of cases that I have seen. And nothing less than a maximum sentence would be appropriate, and anything less than the maximum sentence would depreciate the seriousness of this offense. Deputies, I would respectfully ask that you take this defendant into custody and have him serve the rest of his life in the Department of Corrections. We are in recess.
If this stillness holds you, a quiet gesture helps sustain these long-form investigations. Taking a moment to like the video or subscribe allows stories like this to be examined with the time and care they demand, bringing hidden truths into focus, one layer at a time.
I don't want to be in it. Get lower.
What I'd like to say to the court is that Shannon, Bella, and Nico love and caring people. They love life. They love being around people who love them. They always had good times. This is the first time they went to the beach this year, and they loved it. But God only knows what happened that night. Life will never be the same without Shannon, Bella, and Celeste and Nico. Had all their lives to live. They were taken by a heartless one. This is the heartless one, the evil monster, who dare you take the lives of my daughters Shannon, Bella, Celeste, and Nico. I trusted you to take care of them, not kill them. And they also trusted you. The heartless monster, and then you take them out like trash. You disgust me. They were loving and caring people. You may have taken their bodies from me, but you will never take the love they had from me. They loved us more than you will ever know, because you don't know what love is, because if you did, you would not have killed them. You monster, thought you would get away with this. I don't know how. The cameras do not lie. You carry them out like trash of the house. Yes, I seen the videotape. You buried my daughter Shannon and Nico in a shallow grave, and then you put Bella and Celeste in huge containers of crude oil. You heartless monster. You have to live with this vision every day of your life, and I hope you see that every time you close your eyes at night. Oh, I forgot. You have no heart or feelings or love. Let me tell you something. I will think of them every day of my life, and I love them every day of my life. Prison is too good for you. This is hard to say, but may God have mercy on your soul. I hope you enjoy your new life. It's nothing like the one you had out here. May the courts have no mercy on you. It's hard every day. It hurts in so many ways. I have heard people say that you're not a monster. No, you are not. You're an evil monster. Thank you. Love you, Shannon, Bella, and Nico. Love you, Pop and Dad. And one other thing. And Shannon says she is super excited for justice today. Thank you, Your Honor.
Beach. I don't want them to really go in the ocean. I mean,
My turn.
The pool opens in 2 weeks too.
What's the degrees today?
85 the last I checked. 120.
Wow.
No, Cece.
Yeah.
CC, get girl.
Oh gosh. Oh my gosh, are you kidding? She can climb that fence.
Position of trust with respect to the victim in violation of Colorado Revised Statutes 18-3-102, subsection 1, subsection F. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Count 5 alleges murder in the first degree, a class 1 felony. It alleges that between and including August 12, 2018 and August 13, 2018, Christopher Lee Watts unlawfully, feloniously, and knowingly caused the death of Celeste Watts, a child who had not yet attained 12 years of age, and the defendant was in a position of trust with respect to the victim in violation of Colorado Revised Statutes 18-3-102, subsection 1, subsection F. Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
With regard to these first 5 counts, the minimum sentence that the court could impose if convicted is life imprisonment in the Colorado Department of Corrections, and the maximum death, the sentence is death. Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
Let me also point out that pursuant to Rule 32.1 of the Rules of Criminal Procedure,
Girls.
Oh, CC
Girls.
Bella.
Okay. You want chocolate? No chocolate? If you want chocolate, you just get this bowl. You want this one? Bigger one? We're gonna go.
I love you too.
This is the morning. This is why I love that I thrive. Hey guys, good morning, or I know for Colorado people it's good morning, good afternoon for everybody else. I wanted to come here live because today is the big day for the huge, our cocktail party is tonight where Product X is going to be released. We're super excited. We're heading to the pool right now, and then we have a massage today paid for by Lavelle today at 3:30. So Chris and I are super excited. So we're gonna get a massage after we lay by the pool for a little bit and maybe go to the beach again. And then we're going to go to the cocktail party. And we will be live there tonight.
The house looks like countless others on a quiet suburban street, built for routine, built to contain ordinary family life, built to reassure anyone passing by that nothing dangerous could be happening inside. The silence feels normal at first, the kind of silence that comes with early mornings and closed doors, yet it lingers too long and too evenly, as if emotion itself has been drained from the space. Inside this calm, control has been exercised quietly, not through visible violence, but through emotional withdrawal, through coldness that forces one person to keep reaching while the other learns how to remain untouched. What appears stable from the outside is already fractured within, shaped by a pattern of manipulation where affection becomes conditional and silence becomes power. The threat does not announce itself with chaos or anger. It settles in slowly, disguised as composure, disguised as restraint, disguised as a man who seems harmless because he never raises his voice. Over time, warmth is replaced by tension that has no sound, only weight, pressing down on a family that continues to function because it believes it has no choice. This is not the story of a home invaded, but of a home hollowed out from the inside. And when the quiet finally draws attention, it raises a question that is far more disturbing than noise ever could be. How long had this abuse been hiding behind a face that looked so calm?
Past 3 months I barely slept because I've been going through a lot of different emotions because I did not see this coming. You went from being my brother my sister's protector, one of the most loved people in my family, to someone I will spend the rest of my life trying to understand. What gave you the right to put your hands on a woman, let alone my best friend, my beloved sister, your daughters, and your son? Why weren't they enough for you? In the blink of an eye, you took away my whole world, the people that mattered to me the most. Everything in my life I loved, your children. They trusted you. They loved you. They looked up to you because you promised to keep them safe. Instead, you turned on your family. My blood is boiling as I write these last words because they are the last you will ever hear from me. I can't even think of the right words to describe the betrayal and the hate I feel. And to be honest, you aren't even worth the time and effort it takes to put my pen to this paper. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't cry for my family. They were my whole world. All I do is ask myself why. Why would you do this? You don't deserve to be called a man. What kind of person slaughters the people that love them the most? Did you really think you would get away with this? Did you really think that this was your best option, to throw away your family like they were garbage? They deserve better, and you know it. I hope you spend the rest of your life staring at the ceiling every night, being haunted by what you've done. None of us deserved this. Hearing my mother and father cry themselves to sleep in this hotel room causes me anguish that is beyond words. I can't describe how this feels, how badly my heart is breaking for my poor parents. We trusted you. You have taken away my family from this earth, but you can never take them from my heart. You took away my privilege of being an uncle to the most precious little girls I've ever known. I will never hear the words Uncle Frankie again, but you will never be called Dad again either. You'll never be able to put your hands on another woman, let alone my best friend, my beloved sister, and your son. I just can't comprehend how they weren't enough for you. Shanann, Bella, and Cece loved you more than anyone. You were their hero. How could you destroy the people who loved them the most? I pray that you never have a moment's peace or a good night's rest in the cage you'll spend every day of your life in. A cage you are privileged to live in because my family isn't evil like you. We begged the district attorney to spare your life because despite everything, we believe that no one has the right to take the life of another, even someone like you. I feel sorry for your family. I know the pain that they must feel knowing that they can't hug you, because that's how my mother, father, and I feel every time we cry for our family. Nothing hurts more than watching or hearing my family weep for their loved ones. I just wish that I could tell that you would tell the truth, but I know that that is asking for more than you are capable of. I stayed up all night writing this statement. I don't sleep because of you. My life will never be the same because of you, but at least my conscience is clear. I get to live free, but I can't say the same for you. I haven't slept in 2 days because I've been anxiously waiting for this moment, the moment I get to tell you how I feel, how this has affected my family and I. My family and I can finally grieve after today. If anything, we will come out of this stronger today than we were before, and we will continue to pray for your family. Sincerely, Frankie Rusick.
Thank you, James.
I wanted to say thank you for this moment. I want to take a moment to thank everyone who has prayed for our beloved family, who has sent gifts, cards to us from all over the world. I know God will put the evil people where they need to be. I also want to take the time to thank the town of Frederick, Greeley, FBI, the DA's office, the CBI, for exceptional work. We thank Nicole Atkinson, Shannon's neighbor Nathan, and his family. To me, they're our heroes. They really are. God bless. God makes no mistakes on who he puts in your life. Marriage is about love, trust, and friendship and unity. We marry for sickness and health, to death do us part. Our daughter Shannon loved you with all of her heart. Your children loved you to the moon and back. Shannon's family was her world. Shannon put a crown on your head. But unfortunately, the day that you took their life, God removed that crown. We loved you like a son. We trusted you. Your faithful wife trusted you. Your children adored you, and they also trusted you. Your daughter Bella Marie sang a song proudly. And I don't know if you got to see it, but it was, "Daddy, you're my hero." I have no idea who gave you the right to take their lives. But I know God and his mighty angels were there at that moment to bring them home to paradise. God gives us free will. So not only did you take the family of four, your family of four, you took your own life. I want the world to know that our daughter and her children were so loved by us. There will always be protected by God and his mighty angels. I didn't want death for you because that's not my right. Your life is between you and God now, and I pray that he has mercy for you. From Shannon's mother, Bella Marie, Celeste Catherine, and Nico Lee's Nana. Thank you, Your Honor.
I'm Cindy Watts.
Ron Watson.
Thank you. And I have authorized you to make a statement to the court as paternal grandparents of the children. And if you choose not to make a statement, but your designee, Ms. Powers, chooses to, she can do so as well. How would you like to proceed
Can
today?
I read that? I want you to start, but I would like to read
Who's
that.
going to be speaking today?
Your Honor, initially, they've asked me, and they're hoping that they have the strength to speak, but if they do not, they've written out their statements and asked me to finish for them. So
That would be fine. Who would like to go first?
if I could start, Your Honor. On behalf of the Watts, Your Honor, and to the community, we thank you for the opportunity and the recognition under the Victim Bill of Rights. We come today as the grandparents and the parent of the daughter and children whose life was taken in this case. We are not here to ask for leniency. We are not in any way condoning or tolerating the crime that has occurred and the pain that has been caused. We join in our daughter-in-law and grandchildren's family in saying this should never have happened. This is not condonable. This is something that we will never get over. We appreciate the consideration that everyone has paid, most especially the families that have lost everyone. We appreciate that they begged for Christopher's life. We agree and echo what they have said, that it is not his place to take anyone's life, nor would it be our place as a community to take his life. So we thank you for the opportunity and for every consideration and effort that's been put out. The prosecution in this case has in fact respected the Victim Bill of Rights. They took the time to explain that the information that my clients had at the time that they were interviewed was not correct. They were misinformed. They were searching for answers. They were not intending to cause any pain to anyone, and they appreciate that the prosecution answered their questions and gave them the time and the respect and the consideration so that they could tell this court and everyone in this community that the interview content was not their message, that they accept that their son has done this, that they accept that he chose to plead guilty, that he sought and requested their consent and agreement for a life sentence. They appreciate that he is given the opportunity to serve that life sentence. It is his responsibility, it is his sentence, and it is not enough to make up for what has done. We understand and we join the family in that we have questions. We don't know how such a thing could possibly happen, or that a man that was responsible for raising his children and protecting his wife would take the steps that he did, and that he would disregard their bodies and the love that he had for them and they had for him and everyone else, and take the gestures and put this community through the investigation and the discovery and the responsibility of bringing justice. We do not understand that. We do not think it was appropriate. We cannot begin to think that an explanation will ever justify it. My clients indicate that they understand that a full opportunity for a confession with all of the responsibility and accountability has not occurred. And they support the family and the request that that happen, if not today, at an appropriate time, in an appropriate manner, so that everyone can have peace. To understand to the best of their ability the details that they need and to have their questions answered. And by giving this opportunity of a life sentence, we hope that he embraces that moment. That had the death penalty been pursued, there would not have been an opportunity to be accountable and to give a full confession. And had the death penalty been sought, counsel would have fought for his life, the prosecutors would have been engaged in a multiple-year battle, the families would have been torn apart, this community would have had to subsidize it and endure it, and we have so much respect and gratefulness that that did not happen. We would strongly encourage Christopher Watts to give that full confession in the tone and in the timing that he thinks is appropriate with the guidance of his counsel. We feel that it would be appropriate and helpful to ease the pain and the suffering. But we also say we don't think that there's anything that he can say that will ever account for his behavior. There's nothing that can be done to cure the harm he has caused. And he has the responsibility to serve his sentence with dignity and with regard for everyone, and to spend every breath that he has left in an atonement for what he has done. Do you want to read it?
If I could just have you state your name for the record.
Cindy Watts.
Thank you.
My name is Cindy Watts. I am the grandmother of two beautiful granddaughters, Bella Marie, Celeste Catherine Watts. I am also the mother of Christopher Watts, who I will be directing most of my statement to. First, I'd like to begin by recognizing the absolute horror of this crime and acknowledging the devastating loss that both the Rusek family as well as our family have faced. Our families have been irreparably broken by the needless deaths of Shanann, Bella, Cece, and Nico. This is something we will never get over. We will always mourn the loss of our family, and in that we are united in our grief. I am still struggling to understand how and why this tragedy occurred. I may never be able to understand and accept it, but I pray for peace and healing for all of us. Now to my son Christopher. I have known you since the day you were born into this world. I have watched you grow from a quiet and sweet, curious child who Bella reminded me so much of, to a young man who worked hard in sports and later mechanics to achieve your goals. You are a good friend, brother, father, and son. We have loved you from the beginning, and we still love you now. This might be hard for some to understand, how I can sit here under these circumstances and tell you, although we are heartbroken, although we can't imagine what could have led us to this day, but we love you. Maybe you can't believe it either. As the Lord said in Jeremiah 3:31, I have loved you with an everlasting love. Therefore, I have continued my faithfulness to you. And you, as your mother, Chris, I have always loved you, and I still do. I hate what has happened. Your father and sister and I are struggling to understand why. But we will remain faithful as your family, just as God remains faithful because of his unconditional love for us all. We love you, and we forgive you, son.
Thank you.
Judge, if I could read Mr. Watts' statement.
Yes.
My name is Ronnie Watts, and I am the grandfather of Bella, Celeste, Nico Watts, and I am the father of Shannon. I am the father of Christopher Watts as well. And one of the most important things I've done in my life is to raise my children and to watch as they started their own families. I spent many years coaching Little League and talking to my son, taking him to the races, and sharing my love and knowledge of cars with him. He was just as involved with his girls. I believe he loves his girls. I know he does. This tragedy has impacted my family. in so many ways. Beyond losing our precious grandchildren, our beloved daughter-in-law, we are forced to question everything. We still don't have all the answers, and I hope one day, Christopher, you can help us. Chris, I want to talk to you as a father and son. You are here today accepting responsibility, but I want to tell you this now. I love you. Nothing will ever change that. And I want you to find peace. And today is your first step. The Bible says if we confess our sins, God is faithful and just and will forgive us. Chris, I forgive you, and your sister forgives you, and we will never abandon you, and we love you. Dad. Judge, thank you for the opportunity to address the court.
The house looks ordinary in the way that ordinary can feel like a disguise. In the pre-dawn hours, the streetlights hold their weak, amber halos over a quiet suburban curve. Lawns sit trimmed and damp with night air. Driveways lie still, each one a small stage where nothing is happening. The windows, dark and reflective, turn the neighborhood into a row of sealed aquariums, quiet interiors concealed behind glass. There is a garage door that will rise later, as it has risen so many mornings before. There is a front door that will open to someone heading out, keys in hand, shoulders angled toward a day that is already late. There is a routine waiting to unfold with the dull confidence of repetition. And there is, beneath it, something that does not belong. It does not announce itself with noise. It does not arrive in a rush. It lives in the spaces between movements, in the slight delays that do not have an explanation, in the calm that becomes too careful. It lives in the way the air can feel different inside a home when the people inside are no longer living the same truth. Later, the world will know this address as a kind of symbol, the cheerful facade of a family home turned into an image of absence. But in these first minutes, before the sun, before the calls, before the widening attention, there is only the quiet. A quiet that does not sound like peace. A quiet that sounds like something being held down. In this story, there are no grand staircases or Gothic corridors. There is a modern house in Colorado, built for families who believe the safest dangers are the ones you can see coming. There are bright walls and suburban sidewalks. There are children's rooms meant to hold small lives and small futures. There are photographs that capture the idea of happiness, fixed and smiling as if the camera can preserve it. And then there is the moment when the photographs stop matching the reality. The place is Frederick, Colorado, one of those towns on the northern edge of the Denver metropolitan sprawl where the horizon still has room to breathe. To the west, the mountains can look close enough to touch on a clear day, their presence both comforting and indifferent. The roads are wide. The subdivisions are new. The air smells of grass and asphalt, and sometimes, faintly, of the industrial work that hums beyond the tidy borders of neighborhoods. This landscape has a particular kind of silence. It is not rural emptiness, not city noise. It is the silence of cul-de-sacs at night, the silence of families asleep, the silence of people who trust that tomorrow will resemble yesterday. It is the silence that makes any disruption feel louder than it should, as if the town itself is startled by the idea that something could go wrong here. The family who lived at that address had the shape of a modern, outwardly recognizable life. 2 parents, 2 young daughters, a third child on the way, a home purchased with the kind of optimism that comes with fresh paint and new construction. A steady job, the kind that requires early mornings and long drives and a body that learns to work through fatigue. And a public presence, the kind that turns personal milestones into posts and pictures, birthdays, holidays, everyday moments framed as evidence that life is moving forward. On the surface, it reads as normal. It reads as familiar. It reads to anyone who scrolls past it like the ordinary noise of other people's joy. But a home is not what it looks like from the outside. A marriage is not what it looks like when it is curated. A family is not what it appears to be when the most painful parts happen off camera. Chris Watts moved through life with a particular kind of quiet, the quiet of a man who did not demand attention, who did not seem to take up more space than necessary. People who knew him would later describe a calm presence, a steady demeanor, a lack of the volatility that makes you wary. He looked like someone who could blend into a crowd without trying. He worked in the oil and gas industry, a field that turns invisible energy into visible routine, early shifts, remote sites, mechanical systems, precise steps repeated until they become instinct. The work rewards reliability. It rewards the ability to show up, to keep moving, to follow procedure. It rewards a mind that does not panic. Shannon Watts had a different kind of presence. Her life carried more color, more sound, more motion. She was a mother who documented her children, their laughs, their costumes, their small triumphs. She spoke with energy, with plans, with the bright determination of someone who refuses to let life drift. She moved through the world as if momentum itself could be a form of security. The girls, still very young, belonged to that age where the world is immediate, the next snack, the next game, the next bedtime story. Their lives were built of small rituals and soft routines, the kind parents create to give children a sense of safety in a world they cannot yet understand. There was also the unborn child, a pregnancy that carried its own weight, joy, strain, expectation, a future pressed into the present. A third child changes the geometry of a household. It changes the finances, the fatigue, the patience, the space in a car, the space in a heart. It changes the mental math of how a family survives the day-to-day. Families do not collapse in a single moment. When they break the way ice breaks on a lake, first a crack you barely notice, then a second, then a thin web that spreads under the surface until one step is enough to make it all give way. In the months before everything erupted into public view, there were signs of strain that did not necessarily look like warnings to the people living inside them. A marriage can carry tension for years without outward catastrophe. It can function. It can still produce photographs, dinners, school mornings, weekends, birthdays. It can still look like life, but strain changes the atmosphere. It changes the way people breathe in the same room. It changes the way silence feels. It changes the way a person looks at a phone, at a doorway, at a spouse. It changes the small decisions, whether to talk, whether to ask, whether to answer. It changes the weight of ordinary questions. Financial pressure is one of those strains that rarely appears in a single dramatic scene. It arrives in calculations, in late notices, in private worry, in the tension that creeps into conversations about groceries, childcare, medical bills, vacations, mortgages. It arrives in the subtle shame that can settle on a person's chest when the life they are living costs more than they can comfortably sustain. Emotional pressure can be even quieter. Resentment does not always announce itself. Sometimes it looks like exhaustion. Sometimes it looks like distance. Sometimes it looks like compliance that has stopped being love and started being habit. And then there is the other kind of crack, the one that forms when a person begins to imagine a different life. It is easy to misunderstand how such imagining begins. It is not always a single temptation or a sudden betrayal. Sometimes it begins with attention, a compliment, a conversation that feels lighter than the ones at home, a feeling of being seen in a way that no longer happens in the marriage. Sometimes it begins as relief, an emotional vacation from responsibility. When it deepens, it becomes a private world, a parallel life that runs beside the official one, and as that private world grows, the official world can start to feel like a trap. In Chris Watts's life, that division began to take shape in a way that would later become central to everything. The details, when assembled, suggest not a man swept away in a chaotic storm, but a man quietly stepping from one reality into another, as if he believed he could do so without consequence. As if he believed the life he wanted could simply replace the life he had. There is a specific kind of danger in that belief, because a family life is not a job you resign from. It is not a contract you cancel. It is not a room you leave behind without returning. It is a set of living people whose existence is entangled with yours. And when someone begins to think of them as obstacles rather than individuals, the moral architecture of their mind shifts in a way that can become catastrophic. In the summer of 2018, the Watts household carried the outward signs of an ordinary family and the inward tension of a life turning. There were trips and absences. There were long stretches where the rhythms of the family were disrupted by travel and work schedules. There was communication that did not land the way it used to. There was a sense of imbalance, one person reaching, the other withdrawing. In a marriage, distance can look like many things. It can look like a spouse who is suddenly more interested in the gym, in self-improvement, in changing habits. It can look like someone who becomes more precise about their appearance, their schedule, their privacy. It can look like a person who begins to guard their phone the way one guards a secret. It can look like a reduction in affection that cannot be explained by tiredness alone. It can also look like a spouse who is desperate to pull the relationship back into alignment, trying harder, asking questions, searching for reassurance. The tension between those two movements, one person pulling away, the other pulling closer, creates a friction that can heat a household without ever producing flames. It is an invisible fire, consuming patience, consuming trust, consuming the ordinary warmth that makes a home feel safe. Outside the house, life continued. Chris kept working. The days followed the patterns set by his job, morning alarms, drives into the wide open spaces of industrial sites, the smell of machinery, the strict order of tasks. He was a man surrounded by systems that made sense, systems that responded predictably to effort. At home, predictability was harder. Children do not follow procedure. Pregnancy does not follow a schedule. Marriage does not respond cleanly to inputs. The family sphere is emotional, chaotic, demanding. It is filled with needs that do not wait for you to be ready. If someone has begun to see that sphere as a problem, the pressure grows. The more the private fantasy life expands, the more the real life feels like an intrusion. The more the real life intrudes, the more desperate the fantasy can become. This is how choices begin to narrow, not because the world is forcing them to narrow, but because the person is narrowing them inside their own mind. In this case, what makes the story so chilling is not only what happened, but how it happened within the appearance of calm. The neighborhood did not hear screams spilling into the street. There was no obvious public meltdown, no chaotic spectacle. What unfolded did so behind a closed door, within the carefully maintained boundaries of a home that looked like any other. That is part of why the case lodged itself into the public consciousness with such force. People were not only horrified by the outcome. They were unsettled by the idea that a family could be destroyed from within by someone who looked, to the outside world, like a harmless man. The morning that matters most began like so many others, with darkness still holding the sky, with the ordinary machinery of the world not yet fully awake. In homes like this one, mornings are usually a sequence of small negotiations, finding shoes, packing bags, waking sleepy children, checking the day's schedule. Even when the household is tense, the routine can continue out of necessity. But that morning carried something different, and not because anyone outside could see it. It carried the weight of decisions already made, the invisible momentum of a mind that had moved beyond ordinary conflict. There are moments later when the timeline will be examined in detail, minutes and movements reconstructed with obsessive precision as if clarity could soften the horror. Yet in the living moment, inside the house, there would have been no narrator, no soundtrack, no warning. Only the air, only the familiar rooms, only the sense, perhaps too faint to name, that something was wrong. When Shannon returned home in the early hours after travel, the house would have been a place of expected rest, a bed quiet, the belief that morning would arrive and the children would be there, life continuing. The vulnerability of sleep is one of the most profound trusts we place in those we live with. Sleep is the surrender of vigilance. It is the assumption that the person beside you is part of the safety you are yielding to. In the hours that followed, the story moved toward its irreversible point. The outward world remained untouched for a while. The neighborhood stayed quiet. The sun rose. The day began. And within that ordinary sunrise, a family vanished into the space between what the world expected and what had already happened. By late morning, concern began to take shape in the way concern often begins, not with certainty but with absence. Missed calls, unanswered messages. A failure to appear where one is expected. A sense of unease growing as the usual patterns break. The first ripples of alarm did not come from the street or from strangers. They came from the people who knew Shannon's habits, who understood her routine well enough to recognize that silence from her was not ordinary. In a life that had been documented, a sudden lack of contact could feel like a warning flare. And as that alarm spread, the house that had seemed so quiet in the night became a focal point. It became a place people looked toward with questions. It became a place where ordinary objects, shoes, a purse, a phone, would soon carry a terrible significance. For Chris Watts, the day demanded performance. It demanded a face, a posture, a willingness to occupy the role of concerned husband. It demanded that he move through his neighborhood and his interactions as though he were still living inside the same reality as everyone else. There is a particular coldness in that kind of performance, not necessarily the coldness of a man without feeling, but the coldness of compartmentalization, a mind able to split itself, to hold two worlds at once, the hidden one and the visible one, while trying to prevent them from touching. As the hours passed, those worlds began to collide. The questions began to gather. The small inconsistencies began to glow brighter under attention. The calm, once a protective mask, began to look less like stability and more like something rehearsed. And in the background of those unfolding hours, there was a larger tension rising. The tension between what had occurred inside the house and what could be proven outside it, between the story a person tells and the evidence that refuses to align with it, between the hope that a missing family will simply reappear and the creeping dread that they will not. The day continued, and with each step, the space for ordinary explanations narrowed, leaving behind a corridor of possibilities that grew darker as people moved forward into it. That corridor did not close all at once. It tightened by degrees, with each new observation stripping away one harmless possibility after another. In the first hours, the house itself became a kind of evidence without anyone touching it. Not evidence in the theatrical sense of a dramatic reveal, but evidence in the quiet, domestic sense, the way a home tells on its occupants when something is out of place. The items left behind were not just objects, they were patterns made physical. A phone abandoned when a phone is normally a constant extension of the hand, a vehicle still in the driveway when it should be elsewhere. Medication, personal essentials, the small things that a person does not forget if they are leaving by choice. Shoes and bags, the ordinary gear of a life that should have continued moving. Absence has a shape. It can be measured in what is missing and what remains. The attention gathering around the home brought with it a new kind of light, an unforgiving brightness that makes every shadow look suspicious. The people who arrived with concern did what concerned people always do. They looked for explanations that preserve the world's order. A misunderstanding, a medical emergency, a sudden trip, a dead phone battery, a momentary break in routine that would correct itself with time. But the longer the silence held, the more the explanations began to feel like wishful thinking. For Chris Watts, the house became a stage where stillness could not be trusted. His movements inside it, walking room to room, opening doors, glancing at the places where the girls might have been, were movements that could be read in two ways at once. To an untrained eye, it might look like worry. To an eye sharpened by suspicion, it could look like a man making sure the environment remained consistent with the story he intended to tell. The problem with stories, especially the ones meant to conceal something, is that they require the world to cooperate. They require other people's questions to remain soft. They require time to move slowly. They require all the ordinary variables of life, devices, neighbors, cameras, records, routines, to behave like they do in fiction, where inconvenient details simply do not exist. Reality does not cooperate in that way. In neighborhoods like this one, the modern world has a constant, almost accidental form of surveillance. Doorbell cameras, security systems, passive digital trails left by phones, cars, workplace systems, and social media. None of it feels sinister when life is normal. It feels like convenience, like safety, like a casual record of deliveries and visitors. When something goes wrong, those conveniences become a net. On that street, very quickly, the idea of a camera nearby became significant, not because it promised a clear answer, but because it promised something better than the shifting ground of human memory, an indifferent witness. A device that does not blink, does not soften details out of sympathy, does not rewrite events to protect someone's feelings. The footage, when reviewed, did not show chaos. It did not show a dramatic confrontation. It showed something far more unsettling, routine shapes moving in routine ways at routine times and yet carrying the weight of what had already happened. In the early hours, Chris's truck was visible. Its position, its timing, the manner in which he used it, all began to matter. A person who is simply leaving for work does not usually behave as though they are carefully managing what can be seen. They do not usually linger in ways that suggest calculation. They do not usually make the kind of adjustments that, under scrutiny, start to look like a man working inside a narrow set of constraints. No single moment in that footage was, by itself, a confession. It was the accumulation, the pattern of movements that did not match the casual rhythm of an ordinary departure. And as soon as that possibility entered the room, the narrative shifted. The question was no longer whether Shannon and the children had simply gone somewhere. The question became where they had gone, how they had gone, and why no one knew. At the same time, the digital world began to betray its own illusions. Phones are loyal to routine. They connect, disconnect, and leave traces that can make silence meaningful. When Shannon's phone was found at the house, it did not resolve the mystery. It deepened it. A person can leave without many things, but in the modern age, leaving without a phone is like leaving without a voice. It suggests either sudden disruption or the kind of decision so unusual that it requires an explanation on its own. Her car remained. So did other personal items. The image forming was not of a woman storming out in anger, gathering her children and disappearing into the day. It was of a woman whose normal choices had been interrupted. And with that interruption came a new kind of dread, one that settles in the stomach rather than the mind, because it speaks to the oldest fear that something has happened inside the place that was supposed to be safest. The pressure on Chris tightened in ways that did not need raised voices to be felt. When people are missing, time becomes heavy. Every hour without contact does not just pass, it accumulates, and with it, the urgency grows. Questions become sharper, assumptions become less generous. The room for vague explanations disappears. He still had to exist in the public-facing version of himself. The quiet man, the reliable worker, the father, the husband. But the version of him that was now being studied by those close to the family, by the authorities, by the broader public once attention expanded, was no longer simply who he claimed to be. He was becoming an object of analysis. In that state, even calm can look incriminating. Not because calm is in itself proof of guilt, but because genuine panic tends to have edges. It disrupts speech patterns. It produces unpredictable movement. It leaks through the body. When a person appears too controlled in the face of catastrophe, it creates a dissonance that others can feel even if they cannot articulate it. The investigation moved quickly, not in a cinematic burst, but in the ordinary efficiency of urgent procedure. The immediate circle of the family was examined through routine questions and checks. Friends and contacts were reached. Workplaces were informed. Locations were considered, hospitals, roads, any place where a sudden emergency might have led. At the same time, the family's recent communications began to matter, messages, calls, the subtle emotional temperature captured in written language, the patterns of frequency and tone. This is where modern life becomes a ledger. Not just a record of facts, but a record of emotion, how often someone reached out, how quickly someone responded, what was said, what was left unsaid. And as that ledger was opened, the picture of the marriage began to sharpen into something more complicated than the public imagery suggested. There were indications of tension. There were hints of distance. There were moments where the effort seemed one-sided, where reassurance was sought and not fully given. The pregnancy, which should have been a point of shared anticipation, sat instead as another weight, another responsibility that could bind a person to a life they were already trying to step away from. Behind the family's public face, there was a private unraveling, the kind that often begins with small changes that feel explainable, a new focus on fitness, a different demeanor, a shift in attention. But as the scrutiny deepened, those changes began to look less like self-improvement and more like preparation. Preparation for what is always the question. Then came the other life. It did not enter the narrative as a single dramatic reveal, but as an accumulation of information that made an alternative explanation unavoidable. Another relationship, another set of messages, another person who occupied Chris's attention in the hours and days when his family life was supposed to be central. The presence of that relationship did not, by itself, explain the disappearance. People have affairs and families still remain physically safe. People betray their marriages and do not destroy their households. But the affair did explain something critical. Motive is not always hatred. Sometimes it is escape. Sometimes it is the desire to erase complications rather than confront them. Sometimes it is a person's inability to tolerate the consequences of their own choices. And sometimes, when a person wants a new life badly enough, the old one stops feeling like a moral responsibility and starts feeling like an obstacle. In the days that followed the initial alarm, the question of Chris's movements became central. Work records, GPS data, the ordinary documentation that comes with a job in industrial sites. The places he went when he left that house in the early morning, the places he claimed to be, the places that could be verified. One location in particular began to emerge as significant, an oil field site where Chris had gone that morning, a place with wide open space and the mechanical emptiness of industrial work. Sites like that are not built for witnesses. They are built for function. They have vast stretches of land, access roads, equipment, tanks, structures that look like nothing to those who do not work there. Such places can feel like nowhere, and nowhere in an investigation like this is a dangerous idea. When the focus turned toward that site, the story darkened in a way that did not require graphic detail to be understood. The dread in such moments does not come from imagery. It comes from the mind's ability to connect dots before the body is ready to accept the picture. As search is intensified, the situation moved from missing persons to a grim possibility that many people resist naming until it is forced upon them. The public attention grew. The family's faces, once part of private circles and curated posts, became widely known. There is a particular cruelty in that transformation, how quickly a family can shift from being a personal reality to being a public object. And with that public attention comes something else, pressure that is not just investigative but psychological. A person who has done something irreversible is no longer only fighting evidence. They are fighting time, scrutiny, and the narrowing possibilities of what can still be concealed. Chris was confronted with the necessity of maintaining his version of events while the world around him began to assemble a different one. His words, his explanations, his posture, the manner in which he attempted to account for the absence, all of it existed now under a microscope. The smallest inconsistency became weighty. The smallest over-explanation became suspicious. The smallest emotional mismatch became another thread pulled tight. At a certain point, a person in that position faces an inevitable collision. Either the story holds or it breaks. Either the evidence remains just ambiguous enough to allow hope, or it becomes too concrete to deny. In this case, the collision did not take long. The story began to fracture under the pressure of details that did not align. And as that fracture widened, something changed in the atmosphere of the case. The initial urgency, the hope of finding a missing mother and children alive, began to give way to the heaviness of a different expectation. The truth, when it began to emerge more fully, did not arrive as a single clean statement. It arrived as a grim unfolding, an acknowledgement that what had happened inside that ordinary house was not a misunderstanding, not a sudden departure, but an act that had already severed the family from the future they were supposed to have. And when the search moved toward the place where Chris had gone that morning, the investigation entered a phase where the landscape itself became part of the story. Open land under a bright sky, industrial structures standing indifferent. The kind of terrain where the human body looks small and the human consequences look enormous. The day that had begun with suburban quiet was now stretching outward, away from the home, away from the neighborhood's trimmed lawns and sleeping streets, toward a location where the air smelled of machinery and the ground held secrets that were never meant to be found quickly. The silence was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer the silence of a quiet cul-de-sac before sunrise. It was the silence of a truth moving closer, step by step, while the last remnants of an ordinary explanation fell away. The drive out toward the oil field carries a particular kind of unreality. Subdivisions give way to open stretches where the land flattens and the sky widens, and the familiar markers of domestic life, mailboxes, porch lights, children's chalk drawings, fall away behind the car. In their place come access roads, fenced perimeters, and the geometry of industrial work, gravel lots, metal stairs, warning placards, and structures that exist only to pull something unseen from the earth. It is a landscape that does not care about human narratives. It does not soften itself for grief. It does not respond to prayer or panic. It simply sits there, exposed under daylight, waiting to be searched. At a distance, the site looks like a set of scattered objects against an enormous canvas: tanks, pipes, platforms, and the tall, skeletal frames that signal the presence of wells. Up close, it feels more claustrophobic. Everything is rigid. Everything is designed for function. The air can carry the faint smell of petroleum and dust. The soundscape is mechanical, intermittent, and oddly calm. In a case like this, calm is not comforting. Calm is what allows a person to imagine they can do something terrible without being interrupted. The search does not begin with certainty. It begins with the logic of narrowing. A person left home, a person went to work, a person had access to a remote location, and a family disappeared into the space between those facts. From there, the work becomes methodical, area by area, structure by structure, ground scanned and revisited. The attention given to small details can feel almost absurd to an outsider, but it is in those small details that the larger truth tends to hide. The industrial site offers too many places for a secret to fit. The ground is uneven and interrupted by equipment. The distances are deceptive. A location can look empty while still holding something buried under the ordinary clutter of work. The tanks themselves stand like mute sentinels, sealed and vertical, their presence both obvious and unexamined in everyday life. When a search moves into spaces like this, the atmosphere changes. The people doing the work are no longer looking for a person who might be lost. They are looking for something that cannot call out, cannot signal, cannot be found by chance. The assumption, unspoken but heavy, begins to shift from rescue to recovery. And that shift carries its own grief even before anything is found. The details that emerge in this phase do not arrive with cinematic neatness. They arrive in fragments that build a picture too slowly for the mind to accept all at once. The first confirmations carry a cold weight. This is not a misunderstanding, not a voluntary disappearance, not a family who drove away and turned off their phones. The absence has been converted into something physical, something placed somewhere, something hidden. The moment that reality becomes undeniable is not a moment of drama. It is a moment of finality. From there, everything that follows feels like an aftershock. The home in Frederick becomes less a place of mystery and more a place of aftermath. The public attention, already intense, hardens into something more severe. The family's images, smiling faces, bright eyes, the casual joy of ordinary days, begin to feel like artifacts from a life that has already ended. People who never knew them begin to speak of them as though they did, because the mind resists the idea that such a loss can happen to strangers without leaving some mark. Meanwhile, Chris Watts is no longer simply a concerned husband at the edge of a confusing situation. He becomes, in the logic of the unfolding facts, the central figure around whom everything turns. The focus does not land on him because of a hunch or a mood, it lands because his proximity is structural. He is the last adult known to have been in the home. He has the timeline that intersects with the disappearance. He has the access, the means, the opportunity to shape what happened in the hours when the world was asleep. And as soon as that focus settles, it becomes difficult for any performance to survive. There is a certain kind of pressure that builds when a person realizes the environment is no longer neutral. Every question is a test. Every pause is meaningful. Every detail that should be effortless suddenly requires calculation. The strain of maintaining a constructed reality begins to show, not necessarily in a dramatic collapse, but in the subtle instability of a story being forced to adapt in real time. In this case, the story did adapt, shifting as the space for plausible explanations narrowed. The shape of the account began to change to accommodate emerging facts. The more the outside world learned, the more his version of events had to contort to remain standing. That is often the point when a hidden life becomes visible not through confession, but through contradiction. The contradictions do not always appear as obvious lies. Sometimes they appear as unnatural omissions, as explanations that answer a question too precisely, as details offered in the wrong order, as the tone of someone trying to sound like the person they think they should be. What makes this particular case so unsettling is how ordinary the architecture of it remains. There is no exotic complexity. There is no labyrinth of conspirators. There is one man, one home, two small children, a pregnant wife, and a sequence of decisions made in silence. When the final truth begins to solidify, the mind instinctively looks backward, searching for the earlier moment where everything could have turned another direction. It looks for the first crack that should have been noticed, the first signal that should have triggered alarm. But in most family tragedies, the warning signs do not arrive as warnings. They arrive as stress, as distance, as irritation, as fatigue, as the small resentments that many couples experience and survive. The difference is not always visible from the outside. The difference is inside the private arithmetic of a person's mind, how they measure their own desires against their obligations, how they justify the unthinkable, how they decide what other lives are worth in the face of their own imagined freedom. Once the investigation moved beyond the missing person phase, the machinery of justice began to assemble around the case with a heavy inevitability. Procedures that feel abstract in other contexts become intensely concrete here. Evidence collection, timeline reconstruction, searches, records, warrants, the careful packaging of every detail into something that can withstand scrutiny. The process has its own pace, and that pace can feel cruel to those who are grieving because it does not mirror the human need for immediate understanding. It is slow because it must be defensible. At the same time, the public's hunger for a coherent narrative accelerates. People want to know how it happened, why it happened, what kind of person could do it, what kind of marriage could contain it, what kind of neighborhood could hold it without noticing. They search for patterns in photographs and short clips. They treat facial expressions and body language as if they are keys to a locked room. But the real key in cases like this is rarely a single expression. It is the totality of a life that contains two versions of reality, the version presented to the world and the version lived in private. As the case pressed forward, the weight of the room shifted from uncertainty to accusation. The atmosphere around Chris Watts changed. The space around him, physical and social, began to feel tighter, as though the world itself was closing in. He was no longer simply a man at the center of an unfolding tragedy. He was, increasingly, a man being placed inside the shape of what that tragedy required. In the days that followed, the legal process began to take on its familiar geometry. There are rooms built for this kind of moment, rooms with bright, unforgiving lights, plain walls, tables positioned to keep everyone separated by ritual and rule. There is a posture people adopt when they know they are being watched, when every movement could be interpreted. There is a silence that does not feel like peace but like containment. The case, from that point forward, would not be about finding the missing. It would be about accounting for the dead, and once a case enters that phase, the narrative shifts again. It becomes less about disappearance and more about reconstruction, how a normal day was bent into something irreversible, how a family life was dismantled from the inside, how a man who appeared unremarkable became the center of an act so extreme that the mind strains to place it inside the same reality as suburban lawns and children's bedrooms. What remains most haunting is the contrast that refuses to resolve. The bright daylight on the street where the house sits, the neat lines of the neighborhood, the ordinary surfaces that held an extraordinary outcome, the gap between how a person can look in the world and what they can carry within them. And even as the case moved deeper into formal proceedings, even as the public's attention sharpened into certainty, there remained a quiet question that lingered in the background like a low, persistent hum. How long the truth had been forming before it finally broke the surface, and what it felt like inside that house in the last hours when everyone believed, for a little longer, that morning would arrive like any other. The formal machinery that gathered around the case did not change its emotional gravity. If anything, it amplified it by forcing the private catastrophe into public shapes, documents, timelines, sealed bags, sterile rooms, and the slow, procedural conversion of a family's life into numbered items and recorded facts. In the days after the disappearance became something far darker, the house in Frederick stopped being a home in any meaningful sense. It became a container of traces. The rooms were no longer defined by their purpose, but by what they could yield. A child's bedroom was no longer a place of bedtime rituals and small toys. It was a place where absence could be measured against what remained. A kitchen was no longer a kitchen. It was a map of the last ordinary meal, the last ordinary morning that never arrived. Every surface became suspect. Every object became significant, not because it was inherently dramatic, but because ordinary life leaves patterns, and those patterns can be read when someone is missing. At the same time, the investigation's focus on Chris Watts tightened into something nearly inescapable. He existed at the intersection of all the key realities: the family's last known hours, the access to locations beyond the neighborhood, the work schedule, the private relationship outside the marriage, the sudden shift in his demeanor over the preceding weeks. None of those elements alone would have been enough to establish the full truth. Together, they formed a structure that could not easily support an innocent explanation. The modern world supplies investigators with an unromantic kind of clarity. Not certainty, not an immediate answer, but a dense trail of data that can make lies difficult to sustain. Phone records show patterns of contact. GPS and vehicle data establish movement. Workplace systems establish presence. Security cameras capture timing. Even social media can function as a kind of emotional barometer, showing what a family emphasized, what they celebrated, what they tried to convince themselves was stable. When that trail was assembled, the story it told did not align with the version Chris attempted to maintain. The misalignments were not always obvious to someone hearing the narrative casually, but under scrutiny, they accumulated like weight. The timeline became less flexible. The window for alternative possibilities narrowed. There is a particular desperation that can emerge when a person realizes they are running out of plausible space. A fabricated account depends on ambiguity. It needs time, confusion, and the willingness of others to accept uncertainty. But when facts begin to anchor themselves, this happened at this time, this device was here, this vehicle moved there, ambiguity drains away. In that draining, the person at the center has fewer and fewer options. They can continue to deny, gambling on some gap in the evidence. They can shift the story again, hoping the new shape will fit better than the old. Or they can attempt to offer a partial truth, a version designed to explain enough to stop the pressure without revealing the full depth of what they have done. It was in that narrowing corridor that Chris Watts's story finally changed in a way that marked a turning point. The case moved from an investigation shaped by external reconstruction to one shaped, at least in part, by admission. Even then, the admission did not arrive as a clean, complete account. It arrived as something fractured, an effort to redirect blame, to soften responsibility, to frame events in a way that preserved a shred of moral distance. That impulse is common in people who have done irreversible harm. The mind reaches for a narrative that makes the unbearable feel less like a choice and more like an accident, a reaction, a moment of lost control. The story becomes not simply about what happened, but about what version of what happened can still be lived with. But the facts, once established, have little patience for such reshaping. As the investigation continued, the emerging evidence did not simply contradict his shifting account, it filled in the blanks around it. The gap between his outward demeanor and the interior reality of his choices became starker. The relationship outside the marriage, once a private escape, now appeared as a critical context, an explanation not for the act itself, but for the psychological direction of his life. It showed a man actively imagining a future unencumbered by his family responsibilities, and a man who had begun to see his current life not as something to repair, but as something to remove. The public often asks for a motive as if it is a single, clean answer. In cases like this, motive is not one emotion. It is a convergence, the desire for freedom, the fear of consequences, the exhaustion of maintaining two lives, the resentment of obligations, the fantasy of a clean break, and the profound failure of empathy that allows a person to treat their own family as an obstacle rather than as human beings. When the legal process took hold, it did so with a grim efficiency. The case did not linger for years in a long public fight. The weight of the evidence, the pressure of the reality, and the impossibility of restoring what had been destroyed all pushed toward resolution in the only form the system can offer: charges, pleas, sentencing. Even when a case moves quickly, the speed does not feel merciful. It can feel like a second kind of violence, the way the world rushes forward while grief remains frozen. The family's loved ones are forced to exist inside rooms where the air feels too thin, where every seat, every door, every formal gesture carries the knowledge that the people who should be present are missing forever. The courtroom, when it becomes the setting, has its own harsh symbolism. It is a place designed to be neutral, yet neutrality itself becomes a kind of cruelty when the subject is intimate loss. The lighting is bright and indifferent, the walls are plain, the furniture is functional, the rituals are repetitive. In that environment, the most devastating human realities are reduced to schedules and procedures. A defendant sits where defendants sit. Papers move from hand to hand. The room fills with stillness, punctuated by small motions, someone shifting in a chair, someone swallowing, someone staring at a fixed point as if looking directly at the grief would be too much. The weight of the case is everywhere, but it is carried in quiet ways, tightened jaws, clenched hands, shoulders held rigid as if bracing for impact. For Chris Watts, the public image that had once been defined by suburban normality collapsed into a different kind of visibility. The calm, once interpreted as steadiness, now looked like something else, a controlled exterior that had concealed a life splitting at the seams. The face that had appeared in family photographs became, in the public imagination, a symbol of deception. An ordinary-looking man associated with an act so extreme that it destabilized people's faith in what ordinary means. The plea that resolved the case did not resolve the questions that lingered around it. It did not answer the deeper psychological puzzle of how a person crosses the internal threshold from dissatisfaction to annihilation. The legal system can name the crime, assign responsibility, and impose punishment. It cannot restore meaning. It cannot restore trust. It cannot reverse the moment when a family's future was severed. And yet, the proceedings mattered in a practical sense. They established in formal language that the disappearance was not a mystery of miscommunication or bad luck. It was the result of deliberate acts. They placed accountability where accountability belonged. They stopped the story from remaining indefinitely suspended in ambiguity. Still, the emotional reality remained more complicated than any legal resolution. There is a specific kind of grief in cases involving children, not because the loss is more tragic in some measurable way, but because it violates an expectation so basic that it feels like a law of nature, that adults are meant to protect the young, not destroy them. When that expectation is violated by a parent, the mind struggles to integrate the fact into the same world that contains playgrounds and bedtime stories. It feels like a breach in reality itself. For the wider public, the case became a kind of dark mirror held up to family life. People began to search their own memories for moments they had dismissed, times they had assumed a quiet spouse was simply reserved, times they had assumed a calm household was simply stable, times they had assumed conflict was the only warning sign worth fearing. The case fed a collective anxiety that is difficult to name, that you can live beside someone for years and still not fully know what they are capable of. For those closest to Shanann and the children, the case was not a mirror or a lesson. It was a rupture. It forced them to live with two realities at once, the the memory of the family as they were and the knowledge of how they were taken. It forced them to carry the public's attention while enduring private devastation. It forced them to hear the case discussed by strangers, to see photographs circulated as symbols, to watch an intensely personal loss become a public event. And because Shannon had lived part of her life in public, documenting her family, sharing images of their days, the public felt a kind of proximity. That proximity created empathy, but it also created a strange intimacy. People felt they knew her, felt they knew the girls, felt they knew the house and the rooms and the routines. The familiar became haunted. The story of Chris Watts did not end with a verdict in the emotional sense. It continued in the way the case remained present through documentaries, discussions, and the persistent effort to understand the ununderstandable. People returned to the same images again and again, scanning for hidden meanings, a smile that seemed too fixed, a posture that seemed too stiff, a moment of hesitation that now looked like calculation. The human mind is compelled to search for early indicators because it cannot tolerate randomness at this scale. It wants to believe there were signs because signs imply prevention. But the most frightening truth is that sometimes the signs are not clear enough until after the fact. Sometimes they are simply the ordinary stresses of adult life, money worries, marital tension, fatigue, elements that exist in countless homes without catastrophe. The line between a strained family and a destroyed family is not visible in the same way to everyone. It exists, in part, in one person's internal willingness to cross boundaries most people never approach. Even after the legal process closed its doors on the case, the house itself remained as a kind of physical residue. A structure still standing on a quiet street, holding the outline of the life that had been inside it. Houses do not grieve, but they do persist, and their persistence can feel unbearable to those who associate them with what was lost. The neighborhood continued to exist, the streetlights still casting their dull halos at night, the lawns still being watered, the routines of other families continuing as if routine itself could push the darkness away. Yet for anyone who knew the story, the ordinariness was no longer neutral. It became part of the horror. The idea that a crime of this magnitude could unfold inside a home that looked like every other home was not an incidental detail. It was the core of what made the case linger in the mind, long after the facts were known and the formalities concluded. Because what remained was not only the record of what happened, but the unsettling lesson embedded in the scene, that the most devastating ruptures can be carried out without spectacle, without warning sirens, without a dramatic public collapse. Done quietly, done quickly, done in the hours when the world is asleep, leaving behind a morning that looks normal from the outside until someone notices that the people inside have stopped answering. And once that realization takes hold, the question that follows is not simply what happened in that house, but what changed inside the man who lived there in the weeks before, in the private moments when no one was watching, when the future of his family depended entirely on choices he made in silence. Silence is rarely empty. In a family home, silence is usually filled with practical things, the hum of an appliance, the settling of a floorboard, the soft rhythm of children breathing behind closed doors. It is filled with habit. It is filled with the unconscious confidence that the people inside are still moving in the same direction together, even when they are tired, even when they argue, even when the day feels too heavy. In this case, the silence that gathered around Chris Watts in the weeks before the end was different. It was not the silence of rest. It was the silence of separation. A marriage can survive many forms of strain when both people still recognize each other as part of the same we. The moment that recognition begins to erode, the home changes. The air changes. Small interactions become loaded. A question about money is no longer just a question about money. A comment about work hours is no longer just about fatigue. Even affection can begin to feel transactional, offered as proof rather than felt as truth. Shannon, carrying pregnancy and the responsibilities of 2 small children, lived inside a reality shaped by constant demand. The pace of motherhood does not stop because a marriage is strained. It accelerates. It requires decisions that cannot be postponed and energy that must be conjured from exhaustion. It can also heighten sensitivity to emotional shifts because the stakes feel sharper when another child is on the way, when the future is already being built in the mind. Chris, meanwhile, had begun to live as though the most important part of his life was happening elsewhere. The details of that shift were not visible as a single dramatic change. They were visible in patterns, attention redirected, priorities rearranged, emotional availability reduced. When a person's heart moves away from a family, it often tries to leave the body behind to complete the obligations. The person becomes present but not truly there, and in that partial presence, something dangerous can happen. A family starts to feel like background noise. The spouse becomes a complication. The children become responsibilities that belong to a life the person is already imagining leaving. The unborn child becomes not a symbol of the future, but a tether tightening around the ankle. This is not the way most people respond to strain. Most people, even when they are deeply unhappy, still feel the gravity of their children's existence. They may want a divorce, a separation, a different life, but they still register the child's face as a boundary they will not cross. That boundary is not law. It is conscience. It is empathy. It is the basic recognition that other lives are not props. The tragedy here is that something in Chris Watts's internal world appears to have shifted past that boundary quietly, without a visible struggle that anyone could intervene in. The affair was not simply an emotional detail. It was a framework for a new identity. In that parallel life, he could be seen as unburdened, as fresh, as beginning again. The relationship offered what his home life could no longer offer, the illusion of simplicity. No school schedules, no childcare logistics, no pregnancy appointments, no accumulated debts, no years of shared history weighing down every disagreement. An affair offers a temporary suspension of reality. It makes the future feel clean because it is not yet real. It is an imagined future, built on selective moments, on the best version of a person, on the excitement of being wanted. It can make a spouse at home seem like the embodiment of everything heavy and difficult, not because the spouse is cruel, but because reality itself has become intolerable. And when a person begins to treat reality as intolerable, they start searching not for solutions but for erasure. There were ordinary pathways available: separation, divorce, the painful public admission that the marriage had failed, the financial repercussions, the social consequences, the reshaping of a life that would no longer fit the images posted online. Those pathways are difficult, but they are ordinary. They preserve life. They preserve the possibility that children will grow up and that pain will transform into something survivable. Choosing erasure is not ordinary. It is a different category of decision, one that requires a particular internal logic, a belief that other people's lives can be reduced to inconveniences, that consequences can be managed, that the world can be tricked into accepting a disappearance as a mystery rather than as a deliberate act. In the final days, the tension between these realities intensified. There were communications that carried the weight of suspicion and fear, the sense of a marriage reaching a breaking point. There were efforts to clarify, to confront, to pull the relationship back into focus. There were attempts to name what was happening and force it into the open, because what is named can be dealt with. But when a person has already committed internally to a different outcome, naming the problem does not lead to repair. It leads to panic. It leads to the sense of being cornered. It leads to the fear that the parallel life will collapse under exposure. Exposure is often the true threat in stories like this. Not because exposure is worse than the acts that follow, but because the person's priorities have inverted. They fear being seen more than they fear what they are becoming. This inversion can turn a domestic conflict into something lethal, not through a sudden eruption, but through cold calculation. The person begins to think in terms of obstacles and solutions. The spouse is no longer a partner to negotiate with. She becomes a barrier to remove. The children are no longer children. They become attachments that make the new life impossible. The mind that arrives at that point has already dehumanized its own family. It has turned intimacy into logistics. In the aftermath, much attention would be placed on Chris's demeanor, on how he appeared in the days after the disappearance, on the odd calmness, the constrained effect, the sense that his emotional output did not match the catastrophe surrounding him. But demeanor is not the cause. It is the symptom. It is the residue of a personality that relied on passivity and compliance until passivity was no longer enough to create the future he wanted. A person who spends years avoiding conflict can still carry deep resentment. Avoidance does not eliminate anger, it buries it. It does not resolve dissatisfaction, it defers it. And deferred emotion can harden into something strange, a quiet entitlement, a belief that one has earned an escape without paying the normal price for it. The case became famous in part because the violence was not preceded by obvious public volatility. There was no widely visible record of threats, of open aggression, of the kinds of dramatic warnings people feel more confident recognizing. Instead, the lead-up looked like many marriages under stress, financial strain, emotional distance, changes in intimacy, a new relationship outside the marriage. The difference was not in the outer variables. The difference was in the inner decision. When the bodies were recovered and the facts became impossible to deny, the world's attention often turned toward the question of how a man could do what he did and still attempt to present himself as normal afterward. That question assumes that normalcy is a stable trait. In reality, normalcy is often a performance, a set of learned behaviors that allow a person to move through society without friction. Chris Watts had spent much of his life performing harmlessness. Harmlessness is a socially rewarded role. It invites trust. It discourages scrutiny. It makes people comfortable in your presence. When someone performs harmlessness well, others stop looking for sharp edges. In the days immediately following the disappearance, he continued that performance, but now it had a different purpose. It was no longer about blending in. It was about survival. It was about buying time. It was about keeping the world from seeing what was already true. Time, however, is not neutral in these cases. Time creates urgency. Urgency creates scrutiny. Scrutiny creates cracks. As the cracks widened, the affair became more than a side story. It became a lens through which his choices were interpreted. Not as a simplistic explanation, but as evidence of direction. It showed where his desire was pointed. It showed what he wanted the future to look like. And once that future was visible, the question became not whether he wanted to leave, but how far he was willing to go to leave without losing anything that mattered to him. What matters to a person can be measured not by what they say, but by what they protect when everything is collapsing. In those crucial days, he protected his image. He protected his narrative. He protected the possibility, however unrealistic, that he could step into a new life without being fully seen as the author of what happened. When he eventually entered the legal system's final corridor, the shift from public speculation to formal consequence carried its own kind of stillness. A plea does not feel like an ending. It feels like a door closing. It closes the path of argument. It closes the path of alternative stories. It closes the path of hope that the missing might return alive. But it does not close grief. Grief remains open-ended. It does not conclude when a sentence is read. It continues in mornings and holidays and birthdays that arrive without the people who should be there. It continues in the private moments when a loved one reaches for a phone to send a message and then remembers there is no one to receive it. It continues in the way a family recalculates its identity around an absence that cannot be repaired. The wider public carried the story differently. For many, it became a cautionary tale wrapped around an image, the suburban family, smiling in photographs, living in a house that looked safe. That image was burned into the collective mind because it threatened a comforting belief. That danger is loud. That evil looks like evil. That love can be trusted simply because it is called love. But the deeper truth is less cinematic and more terrifying. The most dangerous transformations can happen quietly inside someone who looks ordinary, and the people closest to them may not realize what has changed until the moment when change becomes irreversible. Even now, when the case is revisited, the gravity returns not because the outcome is unknown, but because the contrast remains unresolved. A man in a neat suburban setting, a family photographed in bright moments, a future that seemed straightforward, and then the sudden conversion of that life into absence, into records, into courtrooms, into a story told and retold because the mind keeps searching for the missing piece that would make it make sense. That missing piece is not a secret clue hidden in a photograph. It is the internal moment when a person decides that ordinary human bonds no longer apply to them, when they decide that the lives around them are negotiable, when they decide that silence can be used not to preserve peace, but to conceal a decision already made. And once that decision exists, even for a moment, everything that follows begins to move with a kind of grim momentum, an invisible gravity pulling an ordinary household toward an outcome that, from the outside, no one would have believed was possible until it had already happened. That momentum does not stop simply because the facts have been established. It continues in the way the case settles into the lives of everyone it touches, like dust that cannot be fully cleared from a room. Even after the system has done what it can do, naming the crime, assigning responsibility, closing procedural doors, the story keeps moving in quieter currents. There is the emptiness of the house, first as a scene, then as a symbol. At the beginning, it is filled with activity, the controlled movement of people documenting, collecting, preserving. Later, it becomes still again, but the stillness is no longer neutral. The rooms hold the outline of what used to be there. A child's bed remains a child's bed, but it no longer belongs to a life that will return to it. A hallway remains a hallway, but it becomes a passage that leads nowhere. Light comes through windows as it always has, and that ordinary light becomes part of what feels unbearable, how the physical world continues unchanged even after the human world has been ruptured. Outside, the neighborhood continues to perform its own normality. Cars pull into driveways. Trash bins are rolled out and brought back. Holiday decorations appear and then disappear. In a place built on routine, routine becomes both comfort and insult. It offers structure to those who are not directly damaged, and it stands like a cruel contrast to those whose lives can no longer follow the same patterns. In the broader public sphere, the case becomes a template. People begin to sort it into categories they can manage: family annihilation, hidden affair, financial strain, suburban deception. The mind wants the comfort of classification because classification implies comprehension, and comprehension implies control. If a tragedy can be sorted into identifiable causes, it can be imagined as preventable, as something that happens to other people who missed the signs. But the reality remains more unsettling. The signs, such as they were not unique enough to function as alarms. Stress and tension exist in many homes. Affairs exist in many marriages. Financial strain is common. What makes this case different is not that those elements were present, but that they converged inside a person who, at a crucial moment, treated the people closest to him as problems to be solved rather than as lives to be preserved. That convergence is difficult to accept because it forces a recognition most people do not want to make. The greatest threat to a household is sometimes not an outside intruder or a sudden accident, but the slow internal shift of a person who stops seeing their family as fully real. When the case moved through the final stages of legal resolution, it did so in an environment designed to be plain. The plainness is intentional. It keeps the system from appearing emotional, from appearing reactive. But plainness does not eliminate emotional pressure, it concentrates it. In a bright, neutral room, the human consequences become sharper because there is nowhere for them to hide. The air feels heavy not because the room is dramatic, but because the people inside are carrying something that cannot be made lighter by procedure. A plea, a sentence, a formal acceptance of responsibility, these events operate like a hinge. They turn the story from uncertainty into permanence. They place the defendant into a fixed category, the way the legal world must, and they push the surviving family members into a life defined by aftermath. There is no longer any question of what happened in the basic sense. The only questions that remain are the ones that have no satisfying answers: why, how, and what was happening inside the mind that made it possible. In the wake of that hinge, Chris Watts's life becomes a narrow corridor. The public version of his identity collapses entirely, replaced by a single defining reality. He is no longer an employee, a neighbor, a husband, a father, a man with routines and errands and ordinary plans. He becomes an inmate, contained by concrete and policy, living in a space that is built to reduce a human being to a controlled set of movements. Yet even in confinement, the case does not become quiet. It continues to live in documents, recordings, analyses, and retellings. The more it is revisited, the more it becomes both fixed and endlessly interpreted. People return to it the way they return to a disturbing photograph, not because they enjoy it, but because they cannot resolve it. The mind keeps searching for the missing element that would make the outcome feel less like a breach in reality. That search often turns toward the idea of mask and performance. In retrospect, every ordinary moment can look like deception. Every family photograph can look like theater. Every smile can appear staged. Every gesture can appear false. But retrospective interpretation is its own trap. It can create the illusion that the truth was visible all along, when in fact the truth was living in a place most people cannot access, the private interior of someone's justifications. A person does not wake up one morning fully formed into what they will become. The shift is gradual, and its gradualness is part of what makes it dangerous. It begins as dissatisfaction. It becomes detachment. It becomes secrecy. It becomes a private narrative where the person is the protagonist who deserves rescue, who deserves a new life, who deserves relief. Over time, that narrative can harden into entitlement, and entitlement can erode empathy. In a healthy mind, empathy functions like a barrier. It stops certain thoughts from becoming plans. It keeps the imagined consequences of harm vivid enough to prevent harm. When empathy is reduced, the barrier weakens. The person can begin to think of outcomes abstractly, as if other people's pain is a distant concept rather than an immediate reality. What makes the case linger is the simplicity of the setting and the extremity of the outcome. The setting suggests safety. The outcome suggests something closer to nightmare. When those two realities occupy the same space, the mind struggles to reconcile them. It becomes easier to imagine that something extraordinary must have been present, some obvious monster, some dramatic warning, some unmistakable sign of danger. But the visible person was not extraordinary. That is the point. The visible person was ordinary enough to be trusted. The aftermath also carries the strange weight of permanence in public memory. Shannon and the children become more than individuals. They become symbols of a particular kind of loss. Their images are shared and reshared, not as privacy, but as proof that they were real, that they mattered, that their lives cannot be reduced to the act that ended them. Yet the repetition can also feel like a second kind of theft, turning a family into content, turning grief into consumption. Still, people return because the case speaks to something deep and uncomfortable, the fragility of the stories people tell themselves about their own homes. Many people live inside an assumption that intimacy guarantees safety, that familiarity guarantees protection, that love, once declared, remains stable. This case undermines that assumption, not by suggesting that danger is everywhere, but by demonstrating that danger can be concealed within the most recognizable shapes of domestic life. Over time, the story's details become fixed in the public mind, the house, the neighborhood, the timeline, the sense of an ordinary morning that was not ordinary at all. But the emotional truth remains fluid. It shifts depending on who is looking at it. For some, it is a story about deception. For others, it is a story about control. For others still, it is a story about the lethal consequences of living two lives and believing that consequences can be managed through silence. For those left behind, it is none of these abstractions. It is the daily reality of absence, the dull ache that does not fade, the sudden moments of memory that feel like physical impact. It is the holidays that arrive with empty seats. It is the birthdays that mark time without the people who should be growing older. It is the knowledge that the future that was supposed to unfold has been permanently erased, and no amount of public attention can restore what was taken. And somewhere beneath all the retelling, beneath all the analysis, beneath all the questions that spiral into psychological theories and cultural fears, the case retains its most haunting core, that the final hours were not marked by sirens or public chaos, but by the quiet interior of a home at night, where a person made decisions that could not be undone while the rest of the world remained asleep, unaware that an ordinary address had already become a place that would never feel ordinary again. The story continues to press forward, not because there is more mystery in what happened, but because there is still a silence around the most difficult point of all, the moment inside one man's mind when his desire for a new life outweighed the basic human recognition that the lives around him were not negotiable. That moment is the one the public returns to again and again, even when it does not realize that is what it is doing. The mind circles it like an animal circling a dark opening in the ground, unwilling to enter and unable to leave it alone. It is not curiosity in the simple sense. It is the instinctive need to locate a boundary, to identify the point where an ordinary dissatisfaction becomes an extraordinary rupture, because if that boundary can be mapped, people can reassure themselves that they would never cross it. But internal boundaries are not posted like road signs. They are not announced. They are worn down. Long before a catastrophic act, there is often a quieter process of rehearsal. Not rehearsal in the theatrical sense of someone practicing a crime in deliberate steps, but rehearsal in the psychological sense. Thoughts that would once have felt unthinkable begin to appear, and instead of being rejected instantly, they are entertained. The mind tests them. It imagines outcomes. It tries them on briefly, like a coat taken from a hook only to be hung back up again. At first, the thoughts can be vague, more emotion than plan, a desire to disappear, a wish that responsibilities would evaporate, a fantasy of waking up in a different life without the current one attached. Most people experience fleeting versions of such fantasies under intense pressure and then move past them because empathy, conscience, and reality pull them back. They remember that other people are not conceptual burdens, they are living beings with their own interior lives. When empathy weakens, the pull back becomes less automatic. The fantasy stays longer. It begins to acquire details. It begins to feel not like an escape hatch imagined in desperation, but like a plausible solution. In the Watts case, the conditions for that rehearsal were present in a particular configuration. A new relationship offered a vivid alternative. Domestic pressure and financial strain offered a heavy present. The pregnancy offered a future that felt, to a mind seeking escape, like a tightening knot rather than an unfolding promise. And the personality structure of the man at the center, quiet, conflict avoidant, invested in appearing agreeable, offered a dangerous tool, the ability to conceal turmoil behind a calm face. People who avoid conflict are not inherently dangerous. Most are simply afraid of confrontation, afraid of rejection, afraid of being seen as the cause of pain. But avoidance can curdle into something darker when it is paired with entitlement and secrecy. A person can begin to believe they should not have to face the discomfort of consequences, that they should be able to move from one life to another without the mess in between. That belief does not appear fully formed. It grows. It strengthens each time the person gets away with a small deception, each time a lie is told and accepted, each time a secret relationship is maintained without immediate fallout, each time two lives are kept separate and the world continues to treat the person as stable and harmless. The reinforcement matters. It teaches the mind that concealment works. By the time the final days arrived, the distance between the outward life and the inward life was no longer a gap, it was a chasm. Shannon and the children belonged to one side, the official life with obligations, expectations, and consequences. The other relationship belonged to the other side, the imagined life that felt cleaner, brighter, and more pleasurable. The problem, from the perspective of a mind that had begun to prioritize fantasy, was that the chasm could not be crossed without a bridge made of pain. Divorce is pain. Public separation is pain. Financial reckoning is pain. The loss of a curated family identity is pain. The possibility of being judged, rejected, or seen as the villain is pain. A person with intact empathy accepts that pain as the price of honesty because it is still cheaper than harm. A person whose empathy has eroded begins to look for a way to avoid paying. This is where the case's chilling ordinariness becomes important again. The environment did not impose chaos. The environment offered opportunity. The house was private. The neighborhood was quiet. The early hours were unobserved by human eyes. Work provided a reason to be out before dawn and to go to remote places. The very structure of his routine, built for ordinary employment, could be repurposed into a structure for concealment. The system of daily life became, in effect, a scaffold. When people ask how something like this can happen, they often imagine a person in a frenzy, overtaken by rage, losing control in a moment that spirals beyond intention. That can happen in some cases, but this case carried a different flavor, less like an explosion and more like a closing. A closing of options, a closing of empathy, a closing of moral space. It felt, in its unfolding, like someone narrowing their own world until the only remaining route was the one that destroyed everything in its path. Afterward, the attempt to maintain normality was not merely a lie told to others. It was a continuation of the same internal strategy. If reality could be controlled through calm presentation, if the world could be guided into uncertainty, then perhaps consequences could be delayed long enough to create a new beginning. The performance of concern functioned as an extension of concealment, a last attempt to keep the two worlds from colliding publicly. But the collision was built in. Missing people create urgency. Urgency creates attention. Attention creates pressure, and pressure is what collapses constructed realities. In the immediate aftermath, the case moved with unusual speed because the contradictions were not subtle enough to sustain a long ambiguity. The timeline was too tight. The physical reality of the home, what was left behind, what was inconsistent, was too stark. The digital traces, indifferent and precise, did not bend to the story being told. And once the search focused on locations connected to his movements, the hidden world of action became vulnerable to discovery in the physical world. By the time the case reached its legal endpoint, the narrative had shifted from searching to reckoning. The question was no longer where the family was, but how the final truth would be spoken in a formal setting without transforming into something sensational or theatrical. Courtrooms do not provide catharsis the way fiction does. They provide closure only in a procedural sense. They bind the story into a fixed legal frame and then move on, because systems are designed to keep functioning even when human lives are shattered. For the people who loved Shannon and the children, the courtroom did not feel like a conclusion. It felt like a forced confrontation with permanence. The formal language, the structured motions, the plainness of the environment, everything emphasized the same brutal fact: there would be no return to the life that existed before. Even the act of listening becomes a form of endurance in such a room. Endurance of names spoken in official context. Endurance of dates and times that turn a loved one's final hours into a matter of record. Endurance of the defendant's presence, not as a husband or father, but as the person legally defined by what he has done. Outside the courtroom, the wider world continued to metabolize the story in its own way. The case became a fixture in cultural conversation because it sat at the intersection of two modern realities: the curated digital family life and the hidden private collapse. People who had never met Shannon felt they had witnessed her life in fragments, and the abrupt end of those fragments created a cognitive shock. A feed that once held ordinary updates became, retrospectively, a record of impending absence. That digital aspect added a particular kind of ache. In older eras, a family's private life would have been largely invisible to strangers. Here, it had been partially visible by design, shared in moments that were meant to be joyful, meant to be proof of stability. The public could see the children's faces, their energy, their small personalities emerging. and then those faces became part of a case file in the public imagination. The mind struggles with that transition because it blurs the boundary between private grief and public consumption. Sympathy becomes entangled with scrutiny. Mourning becomes entangled with speculation. People begin to talk about a family they never knew as if they do know them, because the images create a false intimacy. The family becomes both real and symbolic at once. Through all of it, the central discomfort remains, the idea that the worst danger came from within the home itself, from the person who had been accepted as part of the family's safety. That discomfort feeds the endless return to earlier footage and earlier posts, as if the mind can reverse engineer the moment of transformation. As if it can locate the precise instant when the ordinary became dangerous. But the truth is rarely an instant. It is usually a gradual drift, a person moving further away from shared reality, further away from accountability, further away from empathy, until the life they are living begins to feel like a prison of their own making. And in the final days when pressure mounted and the future narrowed, that internal drift met an external trigger, the looming necessity of explanation. The marriage could not remain indefinitely in the same ambiguous state. The pregnancy made the future more concrete. The financial realities did not disappear. The new relationship demanded choices. The world, in other words, was closing in on the fantasy, forcing it to become either real through honest rupture or impossible through exposure. For someone capable of choosing honesty, that closing in becomes a painful but survivable turning point. For someone who has come to believe consequences are intolerable, the same closing in can feel like suffocation. And suffocation, in the psychological sense, can produce a frantic search for air. Air that the person convinces themselves they deserve, air they imagine waiting on the other side of a door that must be opened at any cost, even if opening it means pushing everyone else out of the room. That is the point where the case remains most difficult to sit with, not in the visible aftermath, not in the public documents, not in the repeated retellings, but in the private interior of that narrowing corridor, when ordinary options still existed and were rejected. And the mind instead committed to a path that would leave an entire family as absence, while one man attempted, for a brief span of hours, to walk through a bright Colorado morning as if the world had not already been permanently altered. In the days after that bright morning, time behaved differently for everyone involved. For the public, time accelerated. Information arrived in bursts, broken into digestible pieces and carried from screen to screen, each update tightening the story into a shape that could be consumed and repeated. For those closest to the family, time slowed into something viscous and punishing, each hour weighted with images they could not push away, each day forcing the body to perform ordinary tasks while the mind remained fixed on what could not be repaired. The contrast between those two experiences is one of the quiet violences of a public case. A private tragedy becomes a shared narrative, and the world's need for clarity runs faster than grief can move. The story becomes a subject, while the people who loved the missing become survivors of something that will never be merely a subject to them. As the legal resolution solidified and the case settled into permanence, a new layer of aftermath emerged, one that cannot be measured by court records or headlines. It lived in the way relationships fracture under unbearable loss. It lived in the way families argue over how to grieve properly, how to preserve memory, how to endure a future that no longer resembles the one they planned. It lived in the way people replay earlier moments with obsessive tenderness, searching for signs of what was coming while knowing that no sign would have been clear enough to stop it. There is a particular ache in remembering a person who was often seen smiling in recorded fragments. Smiles can become traps after a tragedy because they freeze someone in a version of life that will never progress. The mind returns to those images and tries to push them forward into time, tries to imagine the children older, tries to imagine a pregnancy becoming a birth, tries to imagine years unfolding. The imagination keeps building what reality has removed, and each time it does, the loss lands again. The house remained as a physical object long after the family was gone, and that persistence created its own kind of discomfort. A home is not supposed to outlast its inhabitants in such a stark way. Homes usually change hands through ordinary transitions, moves, new jobs, growing families, downsizing. This home carried a different story in its walls, and that story made it difficult to treat the structure as neutral real estate. A buyer does not simply purchase square footage in such a case. A buyer inherits a public memory that clings like smoke. Even for those who never set foot inside it, the house became a symbol of a specific fear, that a place designed for safety can become the opposite without changing its appearance. The exterior remained clean. The driveway remained a driveway. The front steps remained front steps. And yet the address could no longer feel like just an address because the story had fused itself to it. The digital footprint of the family persisted in a different way. Posts and photographs remained available, detached from their original context, transformed into artifacts. In ordinary life, a social media feed is an ongoing record, always moving forward, always adding new details. Here, forward motion stopped. The feed became a closed set, a finite archive, and that finiteness created a feeling that is difficult to describe, as if a life had been turned into a museum display without permission. People who had followed the family casually were left with a sense of interruption, the abrupt cessation of a narrative they had been watching in fragments. Those close to the family were left with something far worse, the knowledge that the same fragments now belonged to strangers, that grief had become shareable, that memory had become public property in ways no one would have chosen. Meanwhile, the man at the center of the case moved into a reality defined by constraint. Confinement does not undo a crime. It does not restore the lost. It does not resolve the internal contradictions that allowed it to happen. It simply contains the person who did it, isolating them from the ordinary world while the ordinary world continues without them. That containment can feel like justice in a procedural sense, but it does not feel like healing. Healing is not something a sentence can impose. In cases like this, the public often expects a clean psychological explanation to appear at the end, as if a definitive motive will emerge that allows everyone to close the file in their minds. But the truth is rarely clean. What emerges instead is a set of conditions and choices, a grim layering of ordinary pressures and extraordinary moral failure, a convergence of self-interest and emotional detachment that does not settle into a single satisfying answer. The mind craves one. It wants a phrase that explains everything. It wants a diagnosis, a label, a simple cause. It wants to believe that this kind of event requires a distinct type of person who can be recognized and avoided. Yet the surface reality of Chris Watts was precisely what made the case so destabilizing. He looked like the kind of person who would never be central to such a story. He did not broadcast menace. He did not live with obvious chaos. He did not fit the cultural stereotype of danger. That disconnect forces a deeper confrontation with a less comforting truth. That appearance is not character, and quietness is not safety. A person can be emotionally absent for years and still be perceived as stable. A person can be withholding and still be perceived as calm. A person can be living a parallel life in secret and still present themselves as ordinary, because ordinary is often just the absence of obvious disruption. The disruptions, in this case, were happening internally. They were happening in the slow process of detachment, in the private rearrangement of values, in the shift from seeing family as loved ones to seeing them as constraints. One of the most haunting aspects of that internal shift is how well it can coexist with routine. People imagine that a mind capable of catastrophic harm would be visibly unstable, that it would leak its intentions through obvious agitation. But routine can function as camouflage. A person can take children to bed, wake up for work, pay bills, smile in photographs, and still be moving toward an outcome no one else can imagine. Routine does not prevent violence. In some cases, it lubricates it because it keeps others from noticing how far the internal world has drifted. This is part of why the case remains so difficult for people who value control and predictability. It suggests that normal life is not a fortress. It suggests that the stability people build can be undermined by a single person's private decisions that may not be visible until they have already taken effect. The family's story, once folded into public consciousness, also became a lesson in the limits of perception. People began to revisit early footage and early imagery with the confidence of hindsight, convinced that the truth had been visible all along. They examined facial expressions and posture as if the body had been signaling danger in clear language. They treated a smile as evidence, treated a quiet demeanor as proof, treated ordinary awkwardness as something darker. Hindsight can be intoxicating because it offers the illusion of mastery. It allows the observer to feel as though they could have known, could have predicted, could have intervened. But in most real lives, people do not have the luxury of hindsight while they are living inside the moment. They interpret behavior through the lens of familiarity, love, and the assumption of basic safety. They forgive inconsistencies because relationships require forgiveness. They normalize shifts because stress produces shifts. They move forward because life demands motion. Shannon's efforts to understand what was happening inside her marriage exist within that ordinary human limitation. When a spouse changes, the first instinct is not to assume catastrophe. The first instinct is to search for the explanation that preserves the marriage, preserves the family, preserves the idea that the person you live with is still fundamentally the person you believed them to be. That instinct is not naive. It is human. It is the reason families function at all. The cruelty of the case is that those human instincts did not protect her. As the months passed and the story continued to circulate, the case also exposed the darker side of public fascination. When a tragedy becomes famous, it attracts not only empathy but also voyeurism, speculation, and the impulse to turn real suffering into entertainment. The family's names and faces became searchable, discussable, revisitable. The worst day of their lives became a narrative people could enter and exit at will, while the people who loved them could not exit at all. In that environment, the quiet dignity of grief becomes hard to preserve. Loved ones are forced to defend the memory of the dead against distortions, forced to witness strangers arguing about intimate details, forced to see their family reduced to theories and talking points. The dead become characters in other people's debates. The public, in its hunger for meaning, often forgets that meaning is not the primary reality here. The primary reality is absence, 2 children who will never grow older, a pregnancy that will never become a life lived, a mother whose plans stopped mid-sentence, a set of futures erased from the calendar of the world. And beneath the broad cultural reverberations, beneath the ongoing discussions and repeated analyses, the case continues to radiate a quieter, more intimate horror. That on a night like any other, inside rooms built for ordinary family life, the fundamental trust that makes a household possible was broken beyond repair, and it was broken not by an intruder, not by fate, not by an accident, but by the person who had been closest to the center of that trust. The story does not truly end in such cases because it never fully releases those who have touched it. It stays in the nervous system. It changes the way people interpret calmness. It changes the way they look at family photographs. It changes the way they measure silence in a home and what they assume that silence might contain. And in the background, like the persistent hum of an appliance left on in an empty house, there remains the enduring, unsettled question that no legal resolution can quiet: what it was like in the final weeks and final days. To live inside a marriage where one person was still trying to hold the family together, while the other had already begun, privately and decisively, to treat that family as something he intended to leave behind, by any means that would allow him to step into a new morning without having to carry the truth of what he had done. In those final weeks, the marriage did not collapse with a single loud rupture. It thinned. It became quieter in the ways that matter most: fewer warm routines, fewer effortless exchanges, fewer moments where 2 people still recognized each other as allies inside the same life. What remained was structure without softness, obligation without ease, and a growing sense that the home had become a place where meaning was being renegotiated in silence. To the outside world, the family still had the recognizable shape of stability: a house, children, plans, a pregnancy that implied continuity. But inside that shape, the emotional architecture was shifting. The small fractures were no longer occasional. they were becoming structural. The kind of strain that can be endured for months began to feel, to at least one person in that home, like something that had to be resolved immediately. And when immediate resolution becomes the goal, patience disappears. A household under pressure produces a particular kind of atmosphere. It is not always argument. Often it is the opposite: careful restraint, a cautious tone, an effort to keep things from escalating even as tension rises. People become polite in ways that do not feel like kindness. They become measured. They choose words as if stepping around something sharp on the floor. One person watches the other more closely. Not in a theatrical way, not as a detective, but in the way a spouse watches when something has changed and they cannot name it. It is an attention fueled by dread and love at the same time. Love that wants to believe, dread that keeps noticing. In that kind of marriage, ordinary events become tests. A delayed response becomes a message. A glance away becomes a statement. A sudden enthusiasm for personal change can look like growth, or it can look like preparation to leave. And as those interpretations battle inside a spouse's mind, exhaustion grows because uncertainty consumes more energy than conflict. At the same time, a person living a parallel life is burdened by a different exhaustion, the fatigue of maintenance. Keeping secrets requires vigilance. It requires compartmentalization. It requires constant adjustment to avoid collision, deleting traces, controlling explanations, managing emotions so they do not leak in the wrong direction. It is a life lived with one eye always on the door. That vigilance can harden into impatience. The secret life starts to feel like the only authentic life because it is the one that carries desire. The official life begins to feel like a performance staged for others: children, extended family, social circles, financial systems, and the public identity built through images. When a person begins to feel their own family is the performance and the affair is the truth, their priorities invert in a way that is profoundly dangerous. They stop thinking about the family as a group of people with equal claim to the future. They start thinking about the family as a role they are trapped in, and the trapped mind begins to look for escape routes. In the days leading up to the final night, the sense of impending confrontation sharpened. There were reasons for that: the pregnancy moving forward, plans that could not be postponed, financial realities that do not bend to denial, and the basic gravity of a marriage that had reached a point where avoidance could no longer function as strategy. When a spouse is no longer willing to accept vague reassurances, the secret life becomes harder to preserve. A person who is cornered by ordinary consequences can respond in ordinary ways: honesty, separation, admission, the painful work of dismantling a shared life while preserving the lives within it. But a person who has become committed to a fantasy of consequence-free escape will experience that same cornering as threat, not to their comfort, but to their imagined future. That is the difference that matters. In the final hours before the house became an epicenter of absence, there was still the outward appearance of routine. Beds, rooms, dark windows, sleeping streets. The familiar landscape of domestic night, when most people believe the dangers of the day have been shut outside and the home has become a sealed refuge. What makes the night in this story so disturbing is not that it was visibly violent. It was that it was quiet enough to preserve the illusion of safety while safety was being dismantled. That kind of quiet is one of the hardest realities for the human mind to accept because it suggests that catastrophe does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives wearing the face of an ordinary night. Afterward, when the disappearance was first reported and the search began, the early hours were shaped by a stubborn hope that still clung to the most generous possibilities. Hope is not rational in those moments. It is protective. It functions like a shield against what the mind cannot yet carry. People close to Shannon resisted the darker interpretations at first because accepting them would mean stepping into a world that could not be stepped out of again. But the case did not allow hope to remain intact for long. The practical realities, what was left behind, what could be traced, what did not align, pushed the story into a different corridor. As attention sharpened, the performance required of Chris became harder to sustain. Each new factual point was another weight placed on a structure already cracking. The longer the pressure held, the more his internal strategy appeared to shift. When denial becomes unsustainable, some people reach for a narrative that is not fully true but feels survivable to them, one that distributes blame away from their own core responsibility, one that frames what happened as reaction rather than initiation, one that tries to preserve the idea that they are not fully the author of their own actions. It is an instinct to reduce the unbearable, to make an act feel like an accident of emotion rather than a choice, to present oneself as someone swept into tragedy rather than someone who engineered it. But reality has a way of resisting such reshaping, especially when the physical world contains evidence that does not bend to narrative. The more the case advanced, the more the distance between any softened version of the truth and the full truth became visible. And with that visibility came the grim sense that the case was not simply about a marriage failing or a man betraying his spouse. It was about the complete collapse of empathy that allowed a person to treat his own family as disposable. That collapse is the part people struggle to imagine, because it requires imagining a mind moving through familiar spaces without the familiar internal restraints. A man walking through a home where his children had laughed, where family photographs were hung, where the rhythms of ordinary days had played out, and yet seeing those objects as belonging to a life he no longer intended to continue. A person with intact empathy experiences children as anchors. Their small bodies and small voices act as constant reminders of vulnerability. They call the adult back to responsibility, even when the adult is angry, even when they feel trapped, even when they want to run. Empathy makes the child's fear and pain vivid enough to prevent harm. When that vividness fades, the danger is not only in what a person might do, the danger is in what they might justify. In the aftermath, the world wanted to know whether the calm exterior had always concealed something dark or whether the darkness was a recent evolution. The truth is rarely a clean answer. Human beings are not single traits. A person can be capable of tenderness in some contexts and cruelty in others. A person can appear passive for years and still carry internal rage. A person can be dutiful until the day they decide duty is intolerable. What becomes clear with time is that the outward image of harmlessness functioned as both disguise and permission. It meant that when tensions appeared, they were interpreted through the lens of normal stress rather than through alarm. It meant that when he was quiet, it was read as steadiness rather than concealment. It meant that the household could drift deeper into instability without anyone outside the marriage recognizing the severity of the internal rupture. Inside the marriage, Shannon's perspective would have been shaped by a different kind of knowledge, the intimate knowledge of daily life, the sense of what was normal for her husband and what was not. When a spouse changes, the partner often recognizes it long before anyone else does. But recognizing change is not the same as recognizing danger. Most partners interpret change as a crisis that can be worked through because that interpretation is the only one that allows the family to keep functioning while the crisis unfolds. That is the cruel paradox of intimate life. The same trust that makes a family possible can also delay recognition of the most severe threats. As the public attention intensified, another dynamic became unavoidable: the transformation of the case into a cultural object. People began to view the story not only as a tragedy, but as a puzzle, a narrative with pieces that could be rearranged in search of understanding. They examined the relationship, the finances, the public image, the affair, the timeline, searching for the moment where the trajectory became inevitable. But inevitability is often a retrospective illusion. The truth is that choices existed until the moment they were rejected. The story did not have to end the way it did. The path was not forced by circumstance. It was selected. That is the heaviest part to carry because it means the disaster cannot be filed under fate. It cannot be blamed on a single accident of timing. It must be placed where it belongs, in the private decisions of a person who, at a crucial point, valued his own imagined freedom more than the lives that depended on him. Once the case reached its legal endpoint, the formal world did what it always does. It reduced the event to charges and outcomes. It placed the perpetrator inside a defined category and then moved forward, because systems must continue. Yet the emotional world does not continue in the same way. It fractures. It repeats. It returns to the same images because repetition is how trauma tries to make sense of itself. And for the family left behind, the grief does not exist in grand statements. It exists in mundane moments, a quiet morning when a child's laughter should have been in the house, a holiday that arrives with a seat that remains empty, a thought that rises unexpectedly, sharp as a cut, because the mind still cannot fully accept that the future stopped. The case remains in the broader imagination as a warning about appearances, about the limits of knowing another person, about the danger of private worlds. But for those who were closest to it, it remains something far simpler and far more brutal: the sudden conversion of love into absence, the permanent disappearance of 2 children and a mother who had been building a future, and the knowledge that the destruction came not from an unknown threat, but from within the circle that was supposed to protect them. In the quiet that follows such knowledge, the world can feel permanently altered. Not louder, not more dramatic, but subtly wrong, like a familiar room with one critical object removed. The routines continue, but they no longer carry the same innocence. The idea of home continues, but it no longer feels unbreakable. And somewhere in the background of every retelling, the same dark pressure persists, the awareness that this story unfolded not in a distant, unrecognizable world, but in a place that looked like any other neighborhood, among people who appeared like any other family, under a sky that rose as it always does, while the most devastating decisions were made quietly enough that, for a few hours, the world still believed it was just another morning. The morning kept moving forward because mornings always do, and that inevitability became part of what people could not stop thinking about. The sun rose over the same rooftops. The light found the same corners of the same rooms. The street outside the house filled with the ordinary motion of other lives, other families carrying backpacks to cars, other parents turning keys in ignitions and backing out of driveways as if certainty were a permanent condition. In that neighborhood, the days did not pause out of respect. They could not. The world is not built to stop when a single household has been shattered. The world continues on rails, and those rails can feel like an insult to anyone trying to hold grief in their hands. It is not that other families are callous. It is that routine is the only thing most people have to keep themselves upright. Routine is the last form of order available when the mind has been shown what disorder can do. As time passed, the case acquired layers that did not exist at the start. At first, it was raw absence and urgent attention. Later, it became a story that could be told, a story that could be summarized. A story that could be reduced into a sequence of facts and outcomes. The reduction served the public need for coherence, but it also created a quieter danger, the possibility that people would begin to treat the case as though it were complete simply because the formal questions had been answered. But completion is a legal concept, not a human one. For those who lived closest to the family, the days did not divide neatly into before and after. They blurred. The past became a room that could be entered without warning. A smell, a song, a child's laughter in a grocery store could open that room again, and suddenly the person standing in line would feel the weight of a memory as if it were happening in real time. In those moments, the mind does not think in neat sentences. It thinks in flashes, small hands, a familiar face, a planned celebration that never arrived. It thinks in the unspent love that has nowhere to go. It thinks in the instinct to reach out, and then the moment when the instinct collides with reality. The case did not remain contained to the people who knew Shannon and the children. It radiated outward through a public that recognized something of itself in the setting. Suburban streets are not unique to Colorado. They exist everywhere. The structure of the life was familiar enough that people could imagine it as their own, and once they did, the story became harder to keep at a distance. Distance is a form of protection. It allows people to believe that danger is reserved for places and lives unlike theirs. This case did not grant that comfort. It unfolded in a landscape built on the promise of safety, and because of that, it invited a particular kind of fear, quiet, persistent, and difficult to dismiss. The fear was not only that something terrible could happen, It was that something terrible could be happening without anyone seeing it. Over time, the world's attention began to settle into patterns. Certain images reappeared again and again. The house, the family portraits. The Colorado sky in the background of everyday moments, blue and indifferent. The mind returned to these images the way it returns to landmarks after getting lost, not because the images contained the answer, but because they anchored the story in something tangible. And then there was the face at the center of it all, the face that had once belonged in a family photograph and now belonged to a different kind of record. The public became preoccupied with that face because it seemed to promise clarity. People wanted to read it the way they read weather, searching for signs of storms. They wanted to believe that if they studied it long enough, they would see the truth shining through. But the human face is not a confession. It is a surface, and surfaces are where people learn to survive. Some learn to survive by expressing everything openly. Others learn to survive by appearing calm, by appearing manageable, by smoothing their own edges so the world will not push back. In a quieter personality, calm can be a genuine trait. It can also be a habit built from avoidance, a way of moving through life without friction. When such a habit is paired with secrecy, calm becomes something else, a tool. It is no longer merely a reflection of temperament. It is an instrument used to manage perception. The most unsettling aspect of this case was how long perception could be managed. The public often searches for the moment when the mask slips. But in many real lives, masks do not slip dramatically. They tighten. They become more controlled under stress, not less. The person holds themselves together because they believe holding themselves together is the only way to keep the world from seeing what is underneath. That kind of control is exhausting. It requires constant suppression of natural reactions. It requires rehearsing language internally before speaking. It requires watching other people's faces for cues, measuring whether the performance is being accepted. And under enough pressure, that effort can produce small anomalies, details that feel wrong in the gut even before they can be explained in the mind. A response too quick, an emotion too distant, a lack of spontaneity where spontaneity would normally appear. The mind notices these anomalies because the mind is trained to read other humans for safety, even when it cannot consciously name what it is reading. This is why people who watched the early footage later described a sense of unease, an instinctive discomfort that preceded full understanding. It was not evidence in itself. It was the body's recognition that something did not fit. As the case became widely known, it also became a kind of reference point for other fears. People began to connect it to the quiet instabilities in their own lives, marriages that felt strained, finances that felt precarious, partners who seemed distant. Many did this privately, without ever saying it aloud, because saying it aloud would feel like inviting disaster into the room. Yet the fear lingered anyway, moving beneath daily life like an underground current. The tragedy also forced a confrontation with the idea of identity, how a person can be perceived as one thing and act as another. In ordinary life, people assume that identity is consistent. A person is a good father, a good husband, a reliable worker, a quiet neighbor. Those categories feel stable because they help the world make sense. But identity, as the case revealed, can be compartmentalized. A person can occupy the role of father in one moment and in another moment operate in a psychological world where that role has been hollowed out. Compartmentalization is not always sinister. It is a common human strategy for managing stress. Yet in extreme cases, it allows a person to behave in ways that contradict their outward identity without feeling the full moral impact of that contradiction in the moment. It is a kind of internal anesthetic. When the anesthetic wears off, or when reality forces the compartments to collapse into one another, the person is left with the full weight of what they have done.